My name is Lise Di Mukwena. I'm 24 years old, and in the next 11 minutes, everything I believed about kindness was about to be tested. It started on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of soft, golden day Atlanta only gives you in early spring. I was standing behind the front desk of a private club off West Paces Ferry Road, wiping a smudge of lipstick off the marble counter. 2 years I'd worked that desk. Long enough to know exactly who wanted sparkling water with lime, who wanted still no ice, no conversation. 2 years of invisible, cheerful competence, keeping a place like that running without anyone upstairs ever noticing I existed. I didn't mind being invisible. Invisible paid the electric bill. Invisible kept my little brother Sipo in his asthma medication. Then I heard the laugh. Not a real laugh. The kind people do when they want you to know they're laughing at something, not with it. I looked up. An old woman had just come through the front doors. Deep brown skin. Silver hair pulled back in a low, neat bun. A house dress washed so many times, the flowers on it had faded to the color of weak tea. Rubber sandals. No purse. Just her hands folded in front of her, like she was waiting for church to start. Our receptionist, Bontle Sitole, was on her feet before the woman had taken 3 steps, 2 security guards flanking her. Ma'am, the service entrance is around back. Loud enough that half the lobby turned to look. This isn't where you ask for water. Nobody moved to help her. A couple in tennis whites glanced over, then went back to their phones like nothing had happened at all. I set my rag down. I don't know exactly why I did what I did next. I've asked myself that 100 times since. But I walked over, and I put my hand under the old woman's elbow, gentle, the way you'd steady somebody stepping off a curb. Would you like some water, Gogo? I said, using the word for grandmother out of pure instinct. Let me get you to a seat out on the terrace. It's cooler out there. She turned her head and looked at me. Really looked, the kind of look that takes its time, like she was reading something written on my face in a language only she knew. My granddaughter had eyes just like yours, she said quiet enough that only I could hear it. Before she passed. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I just walked her out to the terrace, sat her in a wicker chair, and brought her a glass of ice water with a folded napkin under it. Same as I would for any member paying dues in the thousands. I wet a hand towel for her neck because her hands were trembling a little, though I couldn't tell if that was age or something else. Then, without really deciding to, I pulled the folded bills that made up my tip money for the day, $18, all I had until Friday, and pressed them into her palm. She didn't say thank you. She just held on to my hand for a second too long and looked at me like she'd been waiting a very long time to say her next sentence. Good things happen to good people, she said. Remember that, my dear. I laughed it off, the kind of thing you say to be kind back to someone who was just kind to you. I didn't know yet that she meant it as a fact, not a comfort. I want to tell you why I gave her that money, because it matters later. Last winter, when Sipo's asthma got so bad he ended up in the emergency room at Grady Memorial twice in 1 month, I sold the one photo album I had left of our mother, the only one water-stained but whole, just to cover what the insurance wouldn't. My aunt watched me hand it over and laughed. Lesidi, she said, you were born to be the fool who gives everything away. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was. 11 minutes after I sat that woman down on the terrace, I was called into the manager's office and let go on the spot. The reason, typed neatly on the termination form, bringing an unauthorized individual into a premium member space. I walked out through the front doors with my apron still folded over my arm, out onto West Paces Ferry Road, where the wind was picking up before a spring storm. I didn't cry. I just stood there with a single crumpled 20 in my pocket and made myself breathe. That's when my phone buzzed. One text message, no name attached, just a number I didn't recognize. Gogo has been waiting for you since 2:17 p.m. Don't go far. I looked at the timestamp. 2:17 p.m. The exact minute, not close, the exact minute I had knelt down and handed that old woman her glass of water. My stomach went tight. I turned and looked back through the glass doors into the lobby. Nobody was watching me. Nobody was even looking my direction, which meant somebody had been watching this whole thing unfold from inside that club. And they knew things about that moment I hadn't told a single soul. Before I could make sense of it, a long black car pulled smooth and silent to the curb. The window lowered halfway. A man's voice came from inside, deep and even. Miss Lesedi Mokwena Gogo Busisiwe would like to see you again. Today. I stood there on that sidewalk, $18 poorer and one termination letter richer, with no idea that the woman I'd just given my last bit of tip money to was about to change the entire direction of my life. Or that somebody had already been building something around me for far longer than I could imagine. That's where I want to pause. If you believe that quiet kindness never really goes unnoticed, that somebody, somewhere, is always keeping score, then stay with me. The gates of a house I never should have been allowed near. A little girl who hasn't spoken a real word in 8 months, and the first word she says is my name. I almost didn't get in that car. I stood there a good 10 seconds, one hand still holding my termination letter, before I finally opened the door. We drove up through Buckhead, past hedges trimmed so precise they looked painted on, until we stopped in front of a white stone house, 3 stories tall, with an infinity pool that seemed to spill right off the edge of the property. The old woman from the club stood on the front steps. Except she didn't look like the woman from the club anymore. Her hair was still silver, still pulled back neat, but the house dress was gone, replaced with a soft charcoal cardigan and a thin silk scarf. She looked for the first time exactly like what she apparently was. Beside her stood a man I recognized from an Atlanta business magazine, Kahiso Radebe, 32, CEO, holding a little girl who couldn't have been older than 6. The girl wriggled down out of her father's arms, ran straight to me and grabbed a fistful of my shirt. "You smell like her," she whispered. It was the first full sentence Refilwe Radebe had spoken to anyone in 8 months. I'd learned later that her mother had died, and that doctors had a name for what happened to her after selective mutism, and that her father had tried everything to get one more word out of her. Nobody on that porch moved. I heard the wind. I heard somewhere far off a lawnmower. That was it. Kahiso finally spoke quieter than I expected from a man that size. "Gogo would like you to stay. A few days if you're willing." I said no to almost everything they offered. The guest suite, the credit card, the closet of clothes that had just come in the wrong size. I took one thing, a chair at the kitchen table. Each evening helping Refilwe with math homework she wouldn't do for anyone else. I want to be honest. Part of me kept waiting for the catch, but I didn't yet understand how long this had actually been in motion. I'd learned much later that Gogo hadn't found me by accident. For nearly 2 months before that Tuesday, she had been quietly visiting service counters and community centers across the city, grocery stores, clinics, church socials, looking for a particular pair of eyes. She never told me exactly why, not at first. She only ever said, I had to see it for myself before I could believe it. Gogo could have stopped my firing with one phone call. She knew the family that owned that club socially. She didn't make that call. Underneath the calm, composed grandmother was a woman terrified of being fooled twice by the same kind of smiling cruelty that had already cost her one granddaughter. Her test wasn't cold calculation, it was self-protection dressed up as wisdom. She needed to watch what I did with nothing left to lose, because the version of kindness that only shows up when it's convenient was to her no kindness at all. This wasn't the kind of drama family secrets usually stay buried under. This one had been waiting patiently for the right person to walk through the door. On the third day, Tandeka Zulu arrived. She stepped out of a car with the driver, who opened doors for her, kissed the air near Kahiso's cheek, and turned to size me up. Refilwe's new little friend, she said, smiling with just her mouth. Cute. The kind that's easy to replace. That night, she made sure to say something else, pitched loud enough to carry down the hallway. That poor girl only wants money for her sick brother, you know. Refilwe didn't look up from her worksheet, but her pencil stopped moving for almost 30 seconds. Later asleep with her head on my lap, she suddenly jolted awake and pulled a folded, water-stained piece of paper from under the couch cushion. It was a photocopy of an old employment contract. The name on it, Tandiwe Mokoena. My mother. Gogo's signature was at the bottom, and beneath it in careful handwriting, keep this until the one with those eyes comes. Refilwe couldn't read yet, she was 6, but someone had told her to guard that paper, and she had, faithfully, for weeks, since before I ever set foot in this house. The next morning, Kahiso found me in the kitchen before sunrise and slid his phone across the counter. An anonymous email sent to him 3 days before I was fired. One line. Don't leave Tandeka alone with the child. The sender's address traced back to an internal staff account, Bontles. Kahiso rubbed his jaw. I don't understand why she warned me, he said quietly. Not until today. I'd come to understand it myself eventually. Bontle hadn't been part of any plan. She'd humiliated an old woman at a front desk out of plain, ordinary prejudice. And then, in the days after, something had started eating at her. She'd seen the way Tandeka spoke about Refilwe when she thought no one important was listening. Guilt has a way of turning into vigilance if you let it. I went to bed with more questions than I'd started the week with. The next morning, I went to check on Refilwe before breakfast. Her room was empty. The bed hadn't been slept in. The hallway camera had caught only one clear frame. The back of a woman with long, straight hair, leading a small girl by the hand toward a car idling at the edge of the drive. If you were Kahiso, standing there, frozen, while your own mother threw Lesedi out the door without saying a word in her defense, does his silence make him a coward, or a man too broken by grief to trust his own judgment? Yet, Team Kahiso or Team Lesedi? Drop your answer below before segment 3, because what he does next might change your mind completely. 40 minutes. That's how long Refilwe was gone before Tandeka found her at Piedmont Park with a small scrape on her arm, already crying for an audience that wasn't even there yet. I heard the front door before I heard the voices, thrown open hard enough that it cracked against the wall. The sound of heels crossing marble at a speed that didn't match the calm Tandeka was performing a second later in the kitchen doorway. I just took her for ice cream, Tandeka said, sobbing into Kahiso's shoulder. Her mascara somehow still perfect, not a single smudge, which struck me, even in that moment, as strange for someone supposedly hysterical. Naledi Radebe stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the scene with an expression I couldn't read. Not alarm exactly, more like a woman confirming something she'd already suspected. I saw Lesedi on the phone with someone, Tandeka went on. It sounded off. I panicked. I just wanted her safe. Refilwe stood very still near the doorway, not running to either of them, watching the whole performance with the flat, careful eyes of a child who has learned that adults lie loudest when they're the ones who did something wrong. She caught my eye across the kitchen. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They took my phone right there on the counter, Naledi's manicured fingers swiping through it before I could object. There was one missed call from a number I didn't recognize. Sipo, calling from a borrowed phone because his own had been shut off, asking if I could send anything for his inhaler refill before the pharmacy closed. I remember the exact words on the screen because I read them upside down as Naledi held the phone, and something in me went hollow. Reading my own brother's need for help turned into evidence against me. "That's my brother," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "He's asking about his medication. That's all that is." Naledi didn't look up from the screen. "Convenient timing?" "It's not timing. It's Tuesday. He runs out on Tuesdays." Her voice had the temperature of a walk-in freezer. "You have 30 minutes to leave this house. Refilwe will not be around people whose backgrounds we don't fully understand." I looked at Kihiso. Just looked at him, waiting, the way you wait for someone to catch you when you've already started falling. He said nothing, not one word in my defense. I watched his jaw work once, like he was chewing on a sentence he didn't let out. His eyes found mine and slid away toward the window, poured anywhere that wasn't my face. Later, I'd understand that silence better than I did in that moment understand that a man who has already lost one woman he loved sometimes freezes rather than risk being wrong about trusting a second. But standing in that kitchen, all I knew was that the one person who'd asked me to stay wasn't saying a single word to make me stay. I packed my bag in silence, folding each piece of clothing slower than I needed to, giving him every chance to speak. The zipper on my bag stuck halfway, and I remember standing there, working it loose with my hands, not quite steady, aware of Tandeka watching me from the hallway, with an expression that, for just a second, wasn't performing anything at all. It was flat, assessing, almost bored, like a woman checking an item off a list. I noticed it. I didn't understand it yet. I would in 3 weeks, standing in a ballroom. Refilwe caught me at the door and pressed something into my hand. A crayon, drawing 4 stick figures holding hands, and above them, in 6-year-old block letters, Mama Lesedi. Her fingers were cold. She didn't cry. She just held on to my sleeve for 1 extra second before letting go, the exact way Gogo had held on to my hand on that terrace 3 weeks earlier. Like she'd learned the gesture from watching her great-grandmother do it. Walking down that long drive, gravel crunching under my shoes, the hedges Naledi kept trimmed to the inch on either side of me. I thought about a design job in New York I'd turned down 3 years earlier, because Sifo was in the hospital, and there was no one else to sit with him. My cousin took it instead, and posted photos from her new office with a caption mocking, "People who stay small their whole lives." I never told her how much that comment cost me. I thought about it now because it was the same feeling, the exact same one, being handed back to me by a family with a house 3 stories tall and an infinity pool that spilled off the edge of the property, like it had never once had to choose between rent and medicine. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't trust myself to. That night, a text arrived from an unknown number. "Stay away from Refilwe. You don't want to find out what happens if you don't." I sat with my phone in my lap for a long time after that, in the near dark of our apartment. Sipo's breathing audible through the thin wall between our rooms. A little wet, a little effortful. The sound I'd learned to listen for, the way other people listen for rain. I almost deleted the message. My thumb hovered over it. Then, Sipo came running out to the porch, breathing hard, holding a white envelope he'd found wedged in our mailbox. Inside was an acceptance letter to one of the top private academies in Buckhead. Full tuition, 3 years, already paid. The donor line read, "Redebe Legacy Anonymous." Sipo had never applied. I certainly hadn't applied for him. Someone had arranged and paid for my brother's education before I'd even been let go. No, before I'd even been thrown out of that house. Lesidi, Sipo's voice cracked on my name. Half a laugh, half something closer to disbelief. Is this real? I sat down hard on the front steps. A crayon drawing that said, Mama Lesidi. A vague, ugly threat. A tuition payment nobody asked for already sitting in an envelope dated, I checked twice. 3 days before I was even fired. If they'd already gone this far before any of this had even happened, if this was only what I could see, how many more layers of this had been built around me, quietly, without my knowledge, long before I ever walked into that lobby? I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to Sipo's inhaler hiss twice through the wall, running the timeline over and over in my head, like a puzzle with one piece clearly missing and not being able to find it. Tandeka's calm in that kitchen wasn't the calm of a woman confident in her own innocence. It was the calm of someone who had already rehearsed this exact scene in her head more than once, long before she ever needed to perform it. People improvising, real panic, don't move like that. They falter. They repeat themselves. Their timeline shifts each time they tell it. Hers didn't. She wasn't protecting Refilwe from anything that afternoon. She was protecting a plan that had been years in the making. A woman who had watched Kahiso's family write and rewrite, who counted as family enough times that she'd decided the only way to stop being replaceable was to make sure someone else got replaced first. If you were Kahiso, standing there frozen while your own mother threw Lesidi out the door without saying a word in her defense, does his silence make him a coward or a man too broken by grief to trust his own judgment? Yet, Team Kahiso or Team Lesidi? Drop your answer below before segment 3, because what he does next might change your mind completely. I almost didn't go to the gala. 3 weeks had passed since I'd walked down that drive with a crayon drawing folded in my pocket, and in that time, I'd told myself a dozen different stories about why staying away was the smarter choice. Sipo didn't buy any of them. You're going, he said, holding up the hospital receipt I'd left sitting on the kitchen table. The yellowed one from 2019, the month I'd worked 3 jobs to bury our father. I don't know why you kept that thing all these years, but you're bringing it tonight. I don't know why either. I just think you should. I didn't have an answer for him then. I still don't fully accept that some part of me needed to carry proof of every price I'd already paid into a room full of people who thought money solved everything. I stood in the corner of that hotel ballroom in Buckhead, wearing the simplest black dress I could borrow, the receipt folded small enough to fit in my closed fist. The room was all gold light and low-string music, waiters moving between round tables with trays that caught the chandeliers overhead. 300 voices layered into one steady, expensive murmur. I recognized the smell before I recognized any faces. The same cold floral perfume Naledi had worn into my kitchen, except now it was everywhere, mixed with candle wax and champagne thick enough to taste. I hadn't planned to be seen. I'd told myself I only wanted to watch from the back, to understand what I was up against, before deciding whether I was up against anything at all. Then the driver found me. He was easy to miss in a room like that. Dark suit, hands folded, standing near a service entrance, the way men like him are trained to stand invisible until needed. He crossed the room without hurrying and stopped close enough that I could hear him over the music. Gogo said to give you this before it all comes apart. His voice was low, almost apologetic, like a man handing over something heavier than it looked. He pressed a small USB drive into my jacket pocket, his fingers brushing mine for just a second. A recording. Tandeka and Bontle, 1 month ago. I didn't have time to ask him anything else. He was already walking away, back toward the service door, not once looking over his shoulder. The careful, practiced, non-reaction of someone who has decided which side of a story he's finally willing to be on after months of staying quiet. Tandeka Zulu walked onto a small stage under gold lighting a few minutes later, and the whole room turned toward her the way rooms turn toward money. She announced, smiling, with the kind of warmth that never once reached her eyes, that starting today, she would serve as Refile's second mother and take over Gogo's charitable foundation. I watched Kahiso in the front row. He didn't clap. His hands stayed folded in his lap, knuckles pale, his jaw tight, the exact way it had been the night he said nothing in that kitchen. Naledi sat beside him, her face unreadable, though I noticed, because by then I'd learned to notice her hands, that her thumb had started that same small, involuntary circle against her clutch purse. I plugged the USB drive into my phone under the tablecloth, hands shaking slightly. The ballroom noise loud enough around me that no one noticed. The screen behind the stage flickered on. Not the planned slideshow, but shaky footage streamed by accident from a tablet Rafile had left running on a side table while the adults argued down the hall 3 weeks earlier. I recognized the wallpaper behind Tandeka in the frame. It was the same hallway I used to walk past every evening on my way to help with homework. Just as the recording began playing on the big screen, I heard it clearly on my own phone, a half-second ahead. Tandeka's voice, unmistakable, and underneath it, the specific tinny echo of a hallway with hard floors. Just let the Mokwena girl into the house. Gogo likes the loyal, suffering type. When we need to, we'll make it look like she took the child. A woman 2 tables over gasped audibly. Somewhere behind me, a fork clattered against a plate. The room's steady murmur dropped away all at once, replaced by a silence so total I could hear the ice machine behind the bar, and beneath that, very faintly, my own pulse. On the screen, more of the same footage kept rolling. Tandeka talking to someone off camera, her voice flat and businesslike, in a way that made my skin go cold. Let the kid cry. I don't care, as long as Lesedi gets blamed. Once the old woman signs over 40% before her surgery, we're done. Tandeka's smile on stage froze, then cracked at the edges like glass under sudden heat. Her eyes found the screen behind her. She hadn't seen it, yet hadn't understood. And I watched the exact half-second her face went from confusion to something closer to panic, color draining out of it under the gold stage lights. The ballroom went silent enough to hear the ice machine behind the bar. Then the back doors opened. Not more guests, but police, carrying a folder. Inside it was a guardianship petition already filed with the county family court, bearing a forged version of my signature. A judge was scheduled to review and sign it into effect at an emergency hearing the next morning. If I hadn't been standing in that room, it would have gone through unopposed. Refilwe would have become Tandeka's ward before the sun came up. Tandeka didn't set out to become a woman capable of forging custody papers over a 6-year-old. She started out as someone terrified of becoming irrelevant, replaced by whoever Kahiso's family decided was more useful to their name. Every cruel line she said to Refilwe wasn't really about the child at all. It was about a woman who believed love only counted if it came with a title and a share of the estate attached. That's the tragedy under the villainy she mistook security for worth. And by the time she noticed the difference, she'd already convinced herself the child was just a means to an end. Kahiso walked onto the stage, his voice barely recognizable, shaking in a way I'd never heard from him. "You didn't just set up an innocent woman," he said to Tandeka. "You used my daughter to do it." Naledi stood and took the microphone from Tandeka's hand, her fingers no longer just circling her clutch, but trembling openly now. I thought money and status would protect my granddaughter, she said, her voice carrying farther than she probably intended, cracking once in the middle of the sentence. I was wrong. Tandeka tried to bolt for a side exit, her heels loud and uneven against the marble in a way that made the whole room turn to watch. Her own driver stopped her at the door, calm, almost gentle, handing police every threatening message that had ever been sent about Sipo. Proof. I understood only then that he'd been collecting it for weeks, waiting for the one moment it would matter most. Kahiso came down off that stage and knelt in front of me, not to propose, but to say the thing he should have said days earlier. The chandelier light caught the wet in his eyes before he blinked it away. I should have stood up for you the moment they turned you away, he said. I didn't. I'm sorry. I still had a second USB drive in my pocket. I hadn't decided yet whether the world needed to see what was on it. I didn't answer Kahiso that night. The car ride back to Vine City was quiet except for the tick of the turn signal and the hum of tires over cracked asphalt, a sound so different from the smooth glide of Buckhead's private roads that it almost felt like crossing into another country. I held Sipo's inhaler in my coat pocket the whole way, thumb tracing the cool plastic edge just to have something solid to hold on to. Our apartment smelled like the dish soap Sifo always used too much of, and the candle our neighbor gave us last Christmas that we'd never actually lit. He was waiting up, hoodie pulled over his knees, the television playing something neither of us was watching. You're back early, he said, and then softer when he saw my face. That bad? I sat down next to him on the couch that dipped in the middle from years of use. Worse, I said. Better, too. I don't know yet. He didn't push. That was Sipo's way he'd learned the hard way which questions could wait. He just leaned his head on my shoulder, the way he used to when he was small enough that I could still carry him up the stairs when his chest got too tight to climb them himself. Mama would have liked that little girl, he said eventually. Refilwe. The way you talk about her. I hadn't realized how much I'd talked about her until he said it back to me. Yeah, I said. She would have. We sat on the front steps until the sky turned the color of a healing bruise purple, sliding into gray, then gray into gold. Somewhere down the block, a rooster someone kept illegally crowed twice and gave up. I didn't cry. I'd used up whatever tears I had back on that ballroom floor, watching a screen full of strangers' cruelty play out in front of 300 people in cocktail dresses. The 3 days that followed moved slower than any 3 days I could remember. I went back to the design portfolio I hadn't touched in years, the one my cousin used to laugh about, and opened it on my phone at the kitchen table, just to see if the feeling was still there. It was. Faint but there, like a pilot light that had never quite gone out. Kahiso texted twice. Once, whenever you're ready, no pressure. Once, a day later. Refilwe asked if the crayons still work. She wants to draw you another one. I read both messages standing at the sink with my hands still wet, and I didn't answer either one. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't trust my own voice yet to say what I meant without it shaking. On the second night, I took out the one photograph I had left of my mother. Not the album, long gone. Just a single, creased print I'd kept folded in my wallet since I was 19. Tandiwe Mokwena, 26 years old in the photo, laughing at something out of frame, wearing a uniform I didn't recognize until I really looked at it. A pale gray dress with a small embroidered crest at the collar. I'd never thought much of it before. Now, I turned it over in my fingers under the kitchen light and wondered, for the first time, whose crest that was. I didn't have an answer yet, but some part of me had started asking the question. On the third afternoon, I heard the car before I saw it. a low, patient engine sound that didn't belong on our street, followed by the particular silence of a neighborhood noticing something it doesn't usually see. I looked out the window, and there was Naledi Radebe, stepping out in a crisp white blouse, a leather folder tucked under one arm, like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to use yet. She didn't knock so much as announce herself, 3 sharp raps, and when I opened the door, the smell of her perfume arrived a half-second before she did, something cold and expensive like frost on glass. "May I sit?" she asked, already sitting. She set 2 things on my kitchen table side by side with the precision of a woman laying out a hand of cards she was certain would win a check for $200,000 and a temporary custody agreement naming her, Naledi, as Refilwe's guardian should anything ever happen to Kahiso. "This isn't a bribe," she said before I could speak. "Think of it as compensation for your trouble." Her hands were folded on the table, still composed, except for one thumb, which moved in a small involuntary circle against the leather folder's edge. I noticed it because I'd spent 2 years at that front desk, learning to read the hands of people who'd trained every other part of their face to lie. I looked at the check for a long moment. Long enough that I heard the refrigerator hum, and somewhere outside a car door close, and Naledi's breathing, which had gone just slightly shallow, like she was bracing for something. Then I tore it into 4 pieces in front of her. The sound was small paper. Doesn't scream, it just gives up. But it seemed to fill the whole kitchen. Naledi's mouth flattened into a line. Something behind her eyes flickered, there and gone, faster than she probably meant to let it show. I laid the old yellowed hospital receipt from 2019 on the table beside the torn check the month I'd worked 3 jobs at once to help bury my father, back when Sepal was too young to understand why I came home smelling like 3 different kinds of exhaustion. "I have already paid prices steeper than this piece of paper," I told her, "just to keep this family from losing its dignity." Naledi didn't answer right away. She reached down slowly and began gathering the torn pieces of the check off the table. Not out of tidiness, I think, but because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. As she did, another paper slipped loose from the envelope she'd brought, drifting down onto the linoleum between us. A bank statement. 18 months of small, quiet transfers moving through what looked on the surface like a hospital assistance fund into the exact account I used for Sipo's medication. Small enough each time that I'd simply assumed our insurance was finally covering more than usual. I'd never once questioned it. Why would you question mercy? At the bottom of the page, in handwriting I recognized instantly, the same careful looping hand from the old employment contract Refilwe had kept folded under a couch cushion for weeks, was one line. "This was never charity. It's a debt that Adebe family owes to Tandiwe Mokwena, mother of the child with those eyes." I sat very still. The handwriting wasn't as steady as it had been on that old contract. The letters leaned slightly like they'd been written by a hand that had to concentrate harder than it used to. I noticed it and filed it away without understanding yet what it meant. "My mother worked for your family," I said. It wasn't a question anymore. Naledi's jaw tightened. "Before you were born. She looked after Kahiso the first 2 years of his life, back when this family had far less to protect and far more heart to protect it with." A short, humorless breath. "Gogo never forgot her. I'm not sure I ever understood why until I watched you tear up my check just now." Naledi Radebe didn't come to that kitchen table to buy Laseti's silence. Not really. She came because she needed one more time for money to work the way it always had for her, as a solvent that dissolved inconvenient people quietly, without a scene. When it didn't work, when Laseti tore it in half without even raising her voice, Naledi wasn't looking at defiance. She was looking at proof that the one thing she'd spent her whole life trusting, that everyone has a price, had just failed her in her own daughter-in-law's kitchen, in front of a woman with far less than she had and far more to lose. Then her voice went cold in a new way, quieter than before, which somehow made it worse. If you don't sign away all contact with Refilwe in 24 hours, I'll make calls of my own. She nodded toward the hallway, toward the sound of Sipo's uneven breathing, drifting from his room, where he'd been rationing what was left of his inhaler since that morning. Your brother's scholarship can disappear as easily as it appeared. And I know people at his insurer who'd be very interested in reviewing his claims history. I heard Sipo cough once in the next room, dry and sharp. Naledi heard it too. I watched her hear it, and I watched her decide not to care. For the first time, I understood completely. They were willing to unravel everything my brother had just been given, a future he hadn't even had time to believe in yet, just to make me disappear quietly. This is the kind of drama money can manufacture in an afternoon, if the people holding it decide you're expendable enough to spend it on. I walked Naledi to the door without another word. She paused on the threshold, and for just a second, the length of one breath, something that might have been shame passed over her face before she smoothed it away and got back into her car. I stood in the kitchen a long time after the engine sound faded down the block. Then I went and sat across from Sipo, watching him breathe, watching the small effort it cost him, and I thought about my mother, in a gray uniform I'd never understood until today, and about a debt 18 years old that nobody had ever told me I was owed. I picked up the custody waiver page Naledi had left behind. My hand shook, not from fear, I realized, but from how much I suddenly had to lose either way. I stared at that paper. The pen touched it. I hadn't signed yet. A year passed, the way years do, when you've stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, quietly, then all at once. Sipo finished his first year at the academy with a report card he taped to the refrigerator himself, grinning like he'd invented the alphabet. Refilwe learned to write in cursive and used it almost exclusively to sign her drawings. R. Redebe, age 7, artist. Kahiso and I still hadn't set a wedding date, though he'd asked me quietly one evening on that same porch in Vine City, the crickets loud enough that I almost missed the question the first time he said it. When he asked again, I said yes. Before he'd finished the sentence, we finally held a small ceremony at Friendship Baptist Church, the same church where my mother used to sing, decades before any of this began. Morning light came through the tall side windows in long gold bars, catching the dust in the air like something you could almost touch. And the old choir, half of them older than Gogo, sang the same hymn I remembered from childhood funerals and christenings, both because some churches only really have the one song that matters. Refilwe wore a white dress, 2 sizes too formal for a 7-year-old, and stood up in front of the whole congregation to read a short poem she'd written herself, her voice shaking on the first line and steadying by the second. Something about grandmothers and gardens and eyes that look like water. Kahiso's hand found mine on the pew and held on so tightly I could feel his pulse. Gogo Busisiwe handed me a handwritten notebook after the ceremony, her notes on running the Refilwe's Voice Foundation. Pages of it dated back further than I'd expected, like she'd been writing it for me before I'd even agreed to take it on. Her hands trembled more than usual as she passed it over, and I noticed just behind her chair a thin IV line tucked half out of sight beneath her shawl. I hadn't known. None of us, except maybe Naledi, had known she'd come to the ceremony in far worse health than any of us understood. She stood slowly, one hand braced on the pew in front of her, and the whole church seemed to lean in without meaning to. Her voice was weak, but every word landed clear across the room, the way certain sounds carry farther in an empty space than they have any right to. 3 weeks ago, my doctors told me I had 40 days left without surgery, she said. I put it off not to threaten anyone, but because I needed to see this through with my own eyes first. I needed to know what kind of woman would raise my granddaughter. Her gaze found me then, Refilwe then, last Naledi. Now I know. And now I can go into that operating room in peace. What Gogo never said out loud, but what every person in that church understood anyway, was this. She wasn't really gambling with her life over a piece of paper. She was terrified of dying and leaving Refilwe in the care of someone who saw the child as leverage instead of a person. Delaying the surgery wasn't stubbornness. It was a grandmother's last act of protection, the only kind of control she had left over a future she wouldn't be alive to watch unfold. Her relief in the end didn't come from being right. It came from finally being able to let go. The church went quiet enough to hear traffic outside, a bus sighing to a stop somewhere on the street beyond the stained glass. Naledi broke down crying. Not composed, careful tears, but the real kind. The kind she'd probably spent a lifetime learning to hide behind folders and checkbooks and cold even sentences. Kahiso crossed the aisle and wrapped his arms around his mother. And for a moment, I saw them both simply as people who had been afraid for a very long time, in the particular way people are afraid when they've mistaken control for safety. Refilwe ran to me and shouted, the way a child shouts when a feeling is too big for an indoor voice. "Don't let Gogo die!" I knelt down to her height, the way I had that very first afternoon in the marble lobby, and I held both her hands, the way I'd once held her grandmother's glass of water steady, unhurried. "I'm not going to let her go without a fight," I told her. "None of us are." I looked at Gogo. She gave me the smallest smile, the same one from the day I handed her a glass of water on a terrace that felt now like it belonged to another lifetime entirely. I unfolded the custody waiver paper I'd carried unsigned in my bag for a year and set it down on the pew beside me, where everyone could see it if they wanted to. "I'm not signing it," I said. "And Gogo's having that surgery tomorrow. I'll be there." 3 months later, she pulled through. I sat in that hospital waiting room the whole 10 hours. Sifo on one side of me, and Refilwe asleep with her head in my lap on the other. Kahiso pacing a groove into the tile, until a nurse finally came out and said the word stable, and the whole room exhaled at once, like it had been holding its breath the entire time. Which I suppose it had. Gogo's will was made official not long after she recovered enough to sit up in a proper chair again. Notebook and pen in hand, the same trembling handwriting steadier now that the fear behind it had finally lifted. 30% of the family's holdings would belong to Refilwe once she turned 18, the sole legal guardian named should anything happen to Kahiso, me, on the one condition that I keep the name Mokwena for the rest of my life. Gogo told me later, laughing for the first time I'd ever heard her laugh, that it wasn't sentiment. "It's insurance," she said, "that Adebes have a habit of forgetting where their money came from. Your name will remind them." Tandeka was convicted on multiple counts, including forgery and extortion, and sentenced to real prison time, along with a permanent order barring her from contact with children. Bondle apologized publicly in the letter she asked me to read before she sent it, her hands twisting the hem of her sleeve the whole time I read it in front of her. The same nervous habit I remembered from behind that front desk. Except this time, it wasn't cruelty driving it, just plain shame, with nowhere left to hide. I brought her onto the foundation staff myself as a coordinator. Not because I'd forgotten what she said to Gogo that first afternoon, but because I understood now that guilt, which turns into action, is worth something. It's the kind of second chance my own mother never got the opportunity to prove she deserved. Now I sit on the front steps of our new house, not the mansion, just a modest place with a porch and a yard, close enough to Vine City that Sipo can still walk to his old school friends' houses on the weekends. With Refilwe's head resting in my lap, her cursive homework abandoned beside her, and Kahiso grilling dinner out back. The smell of charcoal smoke drifting over the fence in slow, lazy ribbons. Sipo's laugh carries from somewhere near the grill, easy and unguarded in a way it never used to be. I kiss the top of Refilwe's head and say the exact words Gogo said to me the very first day we met. The words that took me a full year to understand were never really about luck at all. Good things happen to good people, but sometimes they've been getting ready for a very long time before you ever notice. This story reminds us that dignity isn't something you announce. It's something you practice quietly on ordinary Tuesdays, long before anyone's watching to reward it. If you're sitting with a cup of coffee this morning, feeling like the people you gave the most to are the ones who noticed you the least, here's something worth trying today. Instead of waiting for it to feel better on its own, call one person who actually saw your worth back then. A sister, an old coworker, a neighbor, and simply tell them you've been thinking of them. Write down on one index card the 3 things you're proudest of doing for your family, and keep it in your kitchen drawer where you'll see it on a hard day. If someone in your life still treats your kindness like a weakness to exploit, you're allowed to set a plain, specific boundary this week. Not a speech, just one sentence said once, calmly. Lissadie's gift wasn't that she never got tired or hurt. It's that she kept choosing who she wanted to be, one ordinary afternoon at a time. And that choice is still available to you today, whatever your Tuesday looks like.